So now this conversation is going to be kind of fun, because we're going to talk about how muscles get energy for their contraction. As many processes, the only fuel for the muscle contraction is ATP. ATP is required for formation of cross bridges, the transport of sodium and potassium, in some cases calcium, whatever. ATP isn't stored in the cell, so it is quickly depleted. So how can you restock? One option is to go through the process named direct phosphorylation. During that process, the molecule of creatine phosphate serves as the source of phosphate for formation of ATP, resulting in creatine and the molecule that we are looking for. Advantages? Well, doesn't require oxygen. Production poor, like seriously low yields. It is very quick. But the amount of ATP that it can generate is not going to last long. Another option is, they call it anaerobic pathway. I disagree with that term, because it has a very specific scientific term. Glucose goes through the process of glycolysis, producing a molecule of pyruvic acid, which then is converted in the process of fermentation. It is a fermentation into lactic acid. This process is also anaerobic, produces more ATP, and it's slower. And unfortunately, the only source of energy, the only chemical that can be converted into energy in this process, is glucose. Now, of course, there is aerobic pathway, aerobic respiration, which can use as an energy source, can use glucose, pyruvate, fatty acids, even amino acids. So you see, it's much more versatile. This process is long, slowest. But it provides the highest yield of ATP, and the energy lasts for a long time. The only downside, it requires oxygen. So it turns out our muscles, they share those pathways. They use all of them at any given moment. But the proportion for a specific type of exercise is different. For instance, if the exercise is a low intensity and it's long, you need something that is finally slow, not a problem, okay? But it can last for a long period of time, so you need aerobic pathway, okay? When your muscle goes from aerobic effort to anaerobic, which is characteristic for high intensity exercise, then muscle switches to predominantly anaerobic, with all the, implications of that. Okay? No, the effort. The effort. I will give you examples. Okay? Now, our muscles consist of 3 types of fibers: slow oxidative, fast glycolytic, and fast oxidative. They different in terms of the main metabolic pathway that they utilize for ATP synthesis, and obviously in terms of the rate of contraction that they can generate. Okay? Now, the rate is determined by the kinetics, how fast the myosin heads break down ATP, and how fast are the signals that received from the motor neurons. Every muscle contains a mixture of the fibers, but within the same motor unit, all fibers have the same type. This is one of my favorite tables. So, hear me out. Fast oxidative fibers, which are in the center. These guys. It is pretty much a hybrid of slow oxidative and fast glycolytic. So I am not going to focus on those. Does that make sense? I am going to compare, and you should be able to compare it. You should be able to compare slow oxidative and fast glycolytic. So let's start with the speed of contraction. Well, obviously, slow in slow oxidative and fast in the fast glycolytic. Now, we already figured that for slow contraction, aerobic pathway will be fine, right? For the fast contraction, hear me out. These fast contractions, they don't last long. Do you understand what I'm saying? So you can use the ATP source, the pathway for ATP synthesis that provides the energy for a short period of time. Anaerobic. Okay? Since oxidative pathway requires oxygen, slow oxidative fibers have a lot of myoglobin, while the fast glycolytic don't. On the contrary, slow oxidative fibers are very efficient in using glucose, so they can produce a lot of ATP from a single molecule. They don't need a lot of glucose, so they don't have a lot of glycogen storages. Remember, glycogen is the way to store glucose. I'm going to quickly write it down. So glucose plus more glucose, glycogen, and then in the time of need, you can break down glycogen into glucose. Now, slow oxidative fibers are used first, but we'll see why. Fast glycolytic are used last. And slow oxidative fibers are very, very fatigue resistant, while fast glycolytic are not. You can get tired very quickly. So that explains which activities use which fibers. If we're talking about the low intensity, long-term exercise, running a marathon or maintaining a posture, that's slow oxidative fibers. When you run a marathon, it's not much of a momentary effort, unless you Eliud Kipchoge, who is the world champion. But like for me, it's nice pace. When you powerlifting or hitting a baseball. When I was before we came to States, I just saw the pictures of baseball players, and I could not understand how you can be that big for the game that includes running. And then I realized it's all about the bat. Like, huh? Well, that's running. Yes, we'll get there. We'll get there. That's actually that's a great example. Okay, so let's compare some exercises. First of all, if you in high school, if your high school had track and field team, you probably saw some long distance runners. Those kids are scrawny, right? They have, because slow oxidative fibers are small, so their muscle volume is pretty low. Now, if you look at people who do the powerlifting or hitting a baseball, diameters are large. Now, that may sound counterintuitive to, they running, but let me ask you, I don't know the distance from one base to another. But it's not that big. It's not that long a run, right? So effectively, it is a very explosive running for a very short distance. It's the same super explosive. This is why they're huge, okay? And they're all juicing. We'll know that. They're just not getting caught. But if you, I don't know, if you watched, well, you're way too young for this, but if you watched the prime of American short distance runners, such as Carl Lewis and Michael Johnson, those guys were, they were big. They were muscular and big. Of course, they were juicing as well. They're all juicing. But they're huge because it's a very short term effort. Okay? Now, another interesting thing about those fibers is that slow oxidative fibers are red because they have a lot of mitochondria and a lot of capillaries. Fast glycolytic fibers are white because they have very few mitochondria and very few capillaries. So I have a question. When you go shopping for beef, what color is it? Red. Well, I mean, we're talking about shades, but overall it's red. Where does it come from? Cows. What do they do, cows, during the day? They eat and walk around. And you can move cows miles and miles if you need to, right? Like cowboys did. Okay? Cows are fine. So cows are marathon runners. Slow oxidative fibers. Have you tried alligator? Yeah, no? Yeah. Yeah. Chicken having sex with fish. It tastes like it is. What color is gator meat? It's white. It is white. Just like chicken. Because, well, I can't imagine, herding a bunch of alligators across, Midwest. You can barely make them. Basically, when we lived in Louisiana, 1 or 2 gators every season, they came out of the lake completely disoriented, and people just walked away from them. They do lunge, but that's it. If they're not gonna chase you. They can lunge at you because that's the massive effort in a short period of time that they can produce. Okay? Now, I deliberately didn't say one important thing here. What dictates the percentage of each type of fiber in a person in its genetics? I don't know. Okay. Who holds the world record, unofficial world record, because marathon does not, they do not acknowledge like the ultimate record because there are a lot of conditions. The route can be different in terms of the elevation and stuff, but who holds the world record for the marathon? I'm not asking the name, I'm asking the ethnic origins. Kenya. Eliud Kipchoge. He's from Kenya. Two other countries that up top are Uganda and Ethiopia. No, wait. Kipchoge, I think, he's Ethiopian. My point is that genetically people, and not everybody but people from those countries, genetically are suited to run fast for a long period of time. That's it. That's it. Not the sports, at that particular sport. Now, I will, yeah, because, so that's the genetic, one of my favorite funny stories. New York Marathon is one of the most prestigious in the world. Like maybe 7-8 years ago, the female competition was won by an American, a white woman. I mean, she's like an Olympic athlete, all of that. For the first and perhaps the last time in I don't know how many tens of years, for some reason, African athletes could make it. That's the only way she could win, because they are so much better. Like, I don't think there was a Caucasian person or any other than those three countries that ever, like, recently won any major U.S. marathon. I mean, like, major. I would count maybe Boston, New York. I don't even know about Chicago. Okay? On the other hand, are you familiar with the competition known as the strongman competition? Any Kenyans in strongman competitions? No. Sure. I'm talking about the elite part. It's Scandinavia, Northern Europe, Eastern Europe. That's it. Those guys, though, like those Vikings from Norway, they suck at running. Like, seriously. Okay? So you can see that genetics does affect it. Now, common question. Can you shift the balance? You can, to a certain extent. You cannot excel at both. If you try to run far and lift a lot, you're going to suck at both. By sucking, I mean, you can, if you want to complete a marathon and say lift 400 pounds and deadlift, you can do it. You're not going to be the fastest. You're not going to be the strongest. Make sense? Okay. Fatigue. Can't contract. Okay? The most important contributor to the muscle fatigue, basically something that you need to remember, ionic imbalances. Okay? So what happens when your muscle works over time, calcium in the cytoplasm that was released from sarcoplasmic reticulum interacts with inorganic phosphate, producing insoluble calcium phosphate and limiting the availability of calcium and phosphate for ATP synthesis. Can you run out of ATP? The answer is yes, but it's very rare. If you run out of ATP, your muscles will go in a contracture, or I always I'm always blanking on the term. Like, the common name Charlie horse. Huh? What is the... I'm blinking on the fancy name for Charlie horse. Spasm. Thank you. I forgot the word spasm. Yes. Muscle spasm. Okay. Anyone did sports, in especially things like, track and field? Yeah? Okay, cross country, fine. Sure. Like when you exercise, that burning sensation in your muscles, did your coach ever mention lactic acid, lactate? No? Well, some coaches say that, when you get tired because of the lactate. This is complete and utter bullshit. Okay? So this is what happens when your muscle crosses that anaerobic threshold. The metabolism switches, hear me out, the metabolism switches from aerobic, full aerobic, to anaerobic. That anaerobic metabolism, basically glycolysis and fermentation, results in accumulation of lactic acid. Lactic acid doesn't hang out in your muscles. It diffuses into the blood and is used by liver and heart as the fuel source. Okay? That makes sense. Now, if you work out real hard, you're going to accumulate a lot of lactic acid, and you're also going to have more fatigue. This is the correlation, but not causation. I'm not going to go into the details of the graphs that you see here, but the force profiles for muscles operating at normal pH and at a pH that can be given by lactic acid, those profiles are the same. So force isn't influenced by lactic acid. Fatigue is, as I mentioned before, because of the ionic imbalances. Lactic acid has nothing to do with it. Another interesting concept is excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, or EPOC. Okay? So, let's say you are doing light exercise. Maybe there is a bit of a mismatch between the oxygen delivery to the muscles and the muscle needing oxygen, so muscle will take a debt. It will collect some oxygen from myoglobin. When the exercise is over, muscle will pay back the debt. Okay? That makes sense? Over time. When we say oxygen debt, we effectively say that once you stop exercising, your muscle still uses a lot of oxygen, and its metabolism is elevated because it needs oxygen for ATP synthesis, and ATP is required for the conversion of lactate to pyruvate, replenishment of glycogen storages, replenishment of ATP storages, basically the restoration of the muscle chemistry. Now, if you take a look at the heavy exercise, your oxygen deficit, your oxygen debt, is much more substantial, which means you're going to be repaying it for a much longer time. All this fancy conversation basically translates to the weight loss programs. The idea to lose weight by running is physiologically absurd, because you spend some calories, when you run, and then you stop, and your muscles recover very quickly. On the contrary, if you go to the gym and you do heavy exercise, even for a relatively short period of time, you can achieve the level of post-exercise oxygen consumption that will be much greater than you can do with running, right? And you effectively are going to burn way more calories over a shorter period of time. Sprinting. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. That's good. Basically what you can do, and it's a great approach. Let's say you are walking. That provides you with aerobic type of exercise, improves your cardiovascular health. And then you do a real hard sprint, lights out, for 100 meters. That will be heavy exercise. Okay? So, to an extent, yes. But if you measure your heart rate when you're doing an insane deadlift, very high intensity, it goes through the roof. And then it goes back to normal. The heart rate only shows you how much oxygen must be delivered to the tissues. Does that make sense? That's it. Okay? Yeah, so the greater the heart rate during the exercise, the more anaerobic the exercise is, which is effectively gives you greater oxygen debt. You're absolutely correct. Does that make sense? But the benefits of resistance training go beyond weight loss. It also, bone density increase, that kind of stuff. But my point is that low intensity, honestly, when I go to the gym and I see people on those, all these fancy cardio machines, my only thought, and sorry if that offends anyone here, you're lazy. I don't like lifting. It's hard, it's heavy. I don't want heavy. I want to sit on my couch, drink beer, and read a book. Or I want to go for a walk. But if I need to give myself a good boost, 30 minutes of heavy exercise. It will be way more calories and metabolic benefit than 30 minutes of jogging. Okay? Muscles produce heat. What else is new? Like, seriously, this is just a cool image of mice before and after exercise. Okay? Yeah. Like, we shiver when we call it, because shivering is a contraction. I need to edit this lecture. Okay. Adaptations. Endurance versus resistance. So endurance training. Increased number of capillaries in mitochondria. Increased amount of myoglobin. Okay? To some extent, you're converting glycolytic into oxidative fibers. Resistance exercise. Heavy lifting. Hypertrophy. Okay? A lot of myofilaments, because hypertrophy. Glycogen storage increases, and a lot of connective tissue. That actually brings me to something I forgot to mention, gym-wise. So remember, we were talking about the force of contraction, the tension, right? And we mentioned hypertrophy. The more muscle you have, the stronger it is. So I want to look up world deadlift record. I looked it up before for females. Okay? So the record, the woman that said it, well, there are different records for different weight categories. So sorry that I have to speak metric, but here's the record for the deadlift among women in the weight class 48 kilograms. That's slightly over 100 pounds. The deadlift is 168 kilos. It's more than 3 times that woman's body weight. Okay? So for me, in order to lift at that level, I have to deadlift about 600 pounds. Okay? Which is fairly insane. But a friend of mine who is a little bit bigger than me now, he's probably, I'm 200, he's 220 maybe. He deadlifts 500 pounds. He's not huge by any means. He's normal sized male. So how does that happen? So if you think about the lifting process, first of all, remember how we were talking about temporal summation? Your brain sends signals to your muscles at ever increasing rate. And if you want to lift heavy, you have to focus. If somebody tells you a joke, you're going to drop the weight. So concentration means frequent stimulation. Okay, then recruitment. Somebody please email me, remind me, I have a dynamometer, hand dynamometer at home. I'm going to bring it. And we're going to try to compare the force that you can develop by squeezing it, if you just squeeze it with your hand or arm, or if you try to recruit muscles of your back and of your trunk and all of that. Spoiler alert, it's going to be increased. So when you lift, you try to recruit as many muscle fibers as possible. But also there's a connective tissue problem. We talked about it when we mentioned tendon reflex. When you progressively increase the weight that you lift, that increases the threshold of activation for your tendon organ, but it also increases the amount of connective tissue within your muscle, not necessarily the size of your muscles. So tendon organ effectively allows you to lift more. It says you have enough connective tissue, your muscle is not going to be torn. Okay? Does that make sense? So progressive increase in the connective tissue is what allows people without, lifting huge masses without getting super big. Obviously, overload, you have to increase the load. Obviously, you have to be careful with and injuring your muscles. Literally, if you overwork your muscles, cells can start breaking down. If that happens, your muscles are going to become inflamed, and if they're severely inflamed, people can develop a condition known as rhabdomyolysis, breakdown of muscles. Development, not much to say. I'm not going to ask a lot. So basically, hear me out. Myoblasts fuse, forming skeletal muscle cells. In cardiac and smooth muscles, myoblasts develop gap junctions. One of the biggest differences between the smooth muscles and other two types, skeletal and cardiac muscles are amitotic, which means cells don't divide, which means if you lose them for good. During a heart attack, some cardiomyocytes die, heart loses some of its ability to produce forceful contraction. Getting there. They do. Actually do. We'll get there. So when somebody experiences the heart attack, the repair is done by connective tissue instead of muscle tissue, and that reduces the contractile force of your heart. Smooth muscles, on the opposite, can divide all the time, growing your blood vessels. Think about a uterus, how it enlarges during pregnancy. Okay? For muscle development, the neuromuscular coordination is critical. It is best around 10-12. So if you have kids or plan to have kids, or they're getting into that age, give them an opportunity to play games that are highly coordinated. Baseball, basketball, I don't know about baseball. Basketball, soccer, hockey. All of it develops neuromuscular coordination, and it's been demonstrated that development of neuromuscular coordination positively impacts cognitive abilities, especially in the team-related games. Okay? Muscle tone. The muscles are always slightly contracted. That is required. So, they're firm, healthy, and ready to respond. If muscles aren't used, they start atrophy. This image on the left shows you the atrophy of the skeletal muscle, and you see what replaces it, right? This is fat. Adipose tissue. Can you regrow it? Yes. Now, one classic example of atrophy due to the lack of use. Astronauts. One of the biggest issues that astronauts faced when they started to do this long-term space flights in the orbital stations, they don't experience gravitational pull, so there's no weight. Okay? Which means their bones become weaker without that weight, and their muscles become weaker. I listened to an interview with an astronaut. Fantastic. I can give you a link. Very interesting podcast. She's a virologist. This is why I was listening to her. But she said that they have to, like they must exercise 2 hours a day. They have special machines that they must work out to slow down muscle and bone atrophy. And yet, there's still some. Okay? Now, in people with spinal cord injury, muscles receive no neural stimulation, which means muscles quickly atrophy. Okay? Does that make sense? So if in this process muscle cells are replaced by connective tissue, which means that rehab is impossible. I have a couple of buddies who are quadriplegic. If for some reason, hypothetically, their spinal cord function would be restored, they wouldn't be able to walk anyway because there's no muscle, not enough muscle in their legs. Now, 30-35 is the magical age for all people. This is when we start our decline. This is when our basal metabolic rate starts going down because thyroid function starts to decline. This is when we start losing our muscle and bone muscle strength and bone density. It's called sarcopenia. What can you do? Work out. And again, resistance training. Resistance training. I'm going to shit on Zumba. I'm going to shit on yoga. For muscle strength, for skeletal strength, resistance training, body weight doesn't matter. But it has to be hard. If you can do an hour of it without stopping, that's not resistance training. Okay? Am I making sense? Okay, I'm not going to ask this on the exam. I just need to comment on this. We still have unresolved argument with a friend of mine, that friend that I mentioned, the power lifter. It's an argument. We need to look up some papers. So obviously, women are not as strong as men. Even if you take women and men of the same size, BMI, age, everything matched. Because less percentage of the body mass. Women have more fat, mostly subcutaneous fat, because they need resources to raise children. I would argue that if you take a completely identical motor unit from a male and a female, they're going to exhibit the same strength. A friend of mine will argue that it's not true. I didn't find any articles. I will accept my defeat if there are studies showing that individual motor units from males versus females have different strength. Muscle pathologies. By and large, we go, muscle dystrophy. They are genetic, start in childhood. So why does that happen? Because in dystrophies, muscles become inflamed, and you may remember that inflammation results in the repair, accumulation of connective tissue. The classic example, Duchenne's. So it is a sex-linked, which means females are carriers, males can suffer from it. Technically, you can imagine a very odd situation when there's a female with this. For this you need a child being conceived by a woman that is carrier and a male that is sick. Usually doesn't happen. Okay? So in this condition there's no dystrophin, which means fibers get damaged. Inflammation results in the connective tissue accumulation and the reduction of muscle mass. Basically all muscles become weak. A posture, you can see the child with the dystrophy on the right, eventually they become wheelchair bound, then the respiratory function declines, and then they die. Okay? There is no cure. Treatments include prednisone, which reduces the rate of destruction. In mice it was shown that utrophin can reverse the dystrophy in mice. And there's a drug called eteplirsen, which allows to kind of circumvent the mutation, and cells are able to produce the proper dystrophin molecules. And then you can see on that graph specifically that line shows you the improvement of the distance that people who are on the drug can walk. Now we're gonna stop here, and we're gonna finish smooth muscles next time, but I'm really happy with the pace we're going with. All right, well, let's chat about smooth muscle. So smooth muscle is a third kind of muscle tissue after skeletal and cardiac, and it is found in the walls of hollow organs, except for the heart, obviously. These hollow organs can include stomach, intestine, gallbladder, urinary bladder, blood vessels, or lymphatic vessels. In many cases, not all the cases, smooth muscle can be organized in multiple layers. Usually there are two of them, longitudinal and circular layers. In some organs, such as stomach, there's a third layer called oblique. So what is the purpose of these two different layers, two muscle layers that are oriented perpendicularly to each other? So longitudinal smooth muscle, in this layer, muscle fibers or muscle cells are parallel to the axis of the organ, which means when this muscle contracts, okay, the hollow organ like this will become shortened and its diameter will increase. Okay, the circular smooth muscle has fibers that go around the organ. So in that circular structure, when it contracts, the diameter of your hollow organ decreases, and when it relaxes, the diameter of the hollow organ increases. The action of both muscles allow for the process known as peristalsis. When circular and longitudinal layers contract in a concerted fashion, they allow the propulsion of the content of the organ, for instance, food in the intestines, along the way. Okay? Now, what are these muscle fibers in the smooth muscle? So these are spindle-shaped cells with one nucleus and no striations. They do not have that structure of skeletal muscle with fascicles and perimysium and epimysium. The only connective tissue that you can find within the smooth muscle is endomysium that surrounds individual fibers. Smooth muscle cells have much less developed sarcoplasmic reticulum, which means not a lot of the calcium storage. It turns out that calcium, which is also essential for the contraction of the smooth muscle, comes from extracellular fluid through the special, should I call them cellular formations? Let's call them cellular formation, called caveolae. Okay? Smooth muscle, unlike skeletal or cardiac, doesn't have sarcomeres, therefore no striations, and it does not have, therefore, myofibrils. However, the filaments, the thick and the thin, are still present. And since calcium comes mostly from the outside of the cell, the activation and the release of calcium from sarcoplasmic reticulum isn't required. Also, the cells are much smaller, so there are no T-tubules in smooth muscles. As you may remember, smooth muscles are controlled involuntary, which means they are the part of our autonomic responses, and autonomic efferent nerves control your smooth muscle contraction. Another big difference between the smooth muscle and the skeletal muscle is the lack of neuromuscular junction. Instead, and we mentioned that word before, there are varicosities or diffuse junctions which release neurotransmitters into a much wider synaptic cleft than skeletal or cardiac muscle. As you can see, the neurotransmitters that can be seeded by a single varicosity can diffuse around and act on multiple smooth muscle cells. It tells you that the contraction of smooth muscles doesn't have to be as synchronized as the contraction of the skeletal muscle. So there are some anatomical differences. I'm not going to focus your attention too much on those. There are more thin or actin filaments, okay, way more, as you can see. Please do not memorize these numbers. What is important in terms of the difference is that smooth muscles do not contain troponin and tropomyosin complex. Okay? Instead of that, the regulation of contraction utilizes some other mechanisms, phosphorylation rather than direct blockage. What's important to understand here is that while you still have these overlapping thick and thin filaments, so that's thick filament, and these are thin or actin filaments. We can say that they are arranged in the shape of a spiral. This corkscrew orientation, which you can see here at the bottom, makes the contraction of the smooth muscle also spiral. They're kind of twisting themselves. Now, the filaments, the thin filaments, have to be attached to something. In skeletal muscle, they are attached to the Z-discs of the sarcomeres. In the smooth muscle, the role of the sarcomeres is assumed by dense bodies. Okay? So, these dense bodies link thin filaments to the sarcolemma, effectively allowing smooth muscle to contract. So now, what can make a smooth muscle contract? And I am fully aware of my shortcomings in terms of the illustration selection. This is not the greatest illustration, but I will make the best out of it. So first of all, smooth muscles contract slow, and many cells contract at the same time. How? Individual cells are connected by gap junctions. We can illustrate it by drawing a primitive gap junction and illustrating that there can be a flow of ions through that junction, okay, which forms what is called functional syncytium. The term syncytium comes from two words, syn, together, and cyto, cells. Some smooth muscle cells can serve as pacemakers. Pacemaker cells can depolarize and contract with no stimulus from the outside. Pacemaker cells are thought to set up your intrinsic contractile rhythm in the intestines. Since smooth muscles are stimulated involuntarily, they can be stimulated not only by nervous signals from autonomic efferents, but also by hormones. For example, here, the list shows the list of the hormones that can stimulate smooth muscle contraction in the wall of the blood vessel. They can be stimulated by chemicals. One of the big ones is calcium, for example. Some smooth muscles can be stimulated by all types of stimuli. Okay. Moreover, hormonal or chemical stimulation may work through G-protein coupled receptors. You may remember G-protein coupled receptors in our conversations about the smell and the taste and the vision. We mentioned the phospholipase C being an important mediator of G-protein coupled receptor responses. I mentioned that before, and I'm going to say it again. GPCRs are going to be one of the key participants in your course on pharmacology when you're going to take it. So now let's see how the smooth muscle contracts. And for this, I'm going to focus on that particular image. Okay? So, calcium, as we mentioned before, mostly comes from the outside. It enters through the channel, or it can enter through the invagination called caveola. So like your membrane does something like that and gulps in some calcium. And then calcium binds to the protein called calmodulin and activates it. This activated calmodulin, or sometimes it is referred as calcium calmodulin complex, CCC, triple C. This activated calmodulin activates an enzyme called myosin light chain kinase. So inactive kinase becomes active. The question that we should answer immediately, what is the role of that enzyme? And kinases add a phosphate residue to different biological molecules. They can be a protein, can be DNA. In this particular case, it's a protein. So look, the reaction is going to look like that. A protein molecule will receive a phosphate residue from ATP, and kinase will catalyze that process. That results in a phosphorylated protein and ADP. Now, why I pay so much attention to that process? If you look at PO4, the phosphate anion, this ion is negatively charged, which means it will change the structure of the protein, which is also a heavily charged molecule, because of the interaction between negatively charged phosphate and some other amino acid residues within the protein. Change in the shape often means change in the function. So that phosphorylation, that kinase can now, the kinase can now add phosphate onto a molecule of myosin. So kinase add phosphate to myosin. On the right, you can see activated myosin, and only after the activation, this phosphorylated myosin heads can form cross bridges. Okay. Does this process make sense? What I'm going to do, I'm going to go through the same process on a slightly different image, because sometimes it really helps. So first, calcium enters the cell, binds to calmodulin, forming complex which activates myosin light chain kinase. This myosin light chain kinase then phosphorylates myosin heads, phosphorylates myosin light chain, and that results in the contraction. So the question is, how do you stop it? How do you stop the contraction in this case? Well, for this, we'll have to take a look at the statement. So for some reason, caveola are not formed anymore, or calcium channels are closed. So calcium does not get into a smooth muscle cell. Absence of calcium means that calmodulin isn't being activated. Without activated calmodulin, myosin light chain kinase isn't activated as well. In the meantime, there is an enzyme called myosin light chain phosphatase, which is like an evil twin of the kinase. Phosphatase removes, inactivates MLCK, which means light chain is not phosphorylated anymore, and muscle relaxes. So let's spell the entire process one last time. Calcium gets in the cell and activates calmodulin. Activated calmodulin activates the enzyme called MLCK, myosin light chain kinase. That enzyme, MLCK, phosphorylates, adds phosphates to the light chain, to the head of myosin molecules, and only after that they can form a cross bridge and start contraction. If calcium levels go down, calmodulin is not activated, MLCK is not activated, myosin heads get slowly dephosphorylated, the phosphates are removed, and smooth muscle eventually relaxes. Okay? So, two important mechanisms that are unique to a smooth muscle: the latch mechanism and so-called stress relaxation response. So the latch mechanism allows smooth muscles to stay contracted for an extended period of time without experiencing fatigue, without using enormous amount of energy. So how does that work? we're going to start here, when actin and myosin filaments are separated. You can see that only after myosin filament gets phosphorylated, they form cross bridges and start the contraction. At some point, the phosphate, this phosphate, is removed from the myosin filament. And they supposed to separate, but they don't. That's the feature of those cross bridges. I mean, they do, but this constant is really, really low. So this reaction is slow. You can see it, to some extent, as sort of a smooth muscle analogy to rigor mortis that we discussed in skeletal muscle. They still latched on to each other. They still are in the contracted state. They don't contract anymore. They don't move. They don't change their length. But once they shortened, they remain shortened. Now, the relaxation eventually will happen, but it takes a lot of time. The second response is stress relaxation response. Now, this is the academic explanation right here, okay? So imagine bladder filling up with urine. So pressure within the bladder will increase. The radius of the bladder will increase. And the tension of the walls will increase as well. Now, pressure will be directly proportional to the tension of the wall and inversely proportional to the radius of the lumen. But if pressure in your bladder increases, it can't increase indefinitely, right? At some point, the urine will find a way to go, either pushing through the urethra, even if you don't want that, or just exploding your bladder. And that is going to be pretty quick unless your muscles in the wall manage to relax, to reduce their tension. If tension is reduced, the pressure is reduced. Okay? So again, you pour, quote unquote, pour urine into the bladder. It stretches out, which technically increases tension. But as smooth muscle are stretched, they also relax. Okay? And that allows them to lower the pressure and also allows them to contract when they are very much relaxed. They actually are much better than skeletal muscle in terms of the ability to contract while being stretched or contracted. So, you see, unlike skeletal muscle, which maintains its contractile ability between 80 and 20%, smooth muscle can maintain it in the range between 50 to 200% of its resting length. Now, smooth muscles is the only type of muscle tissue that can divide. Skeletal and cardiac muscles cannot. Example, growth of uterus during puberty or during pregnancy. However, sometimes the growth of smooth muscle isn't a good thing. So, for example, in the vascular condition known as atherosclerosis, blood vessels become inflamed at the sites where the atherosclerotic plaque is formed. That inflammation triggers repair, and as a part of that repair, smooth muscles replicate within the, I have to correct myself here, I feel very embarrassed. It's not tunica intima, it's tunica media. Not for the exam, but just, okay? Now, if you start looking at the diameter of the blood vessel, so this is the healthy blood vessel. You see the diameter? And this is not. Okay? You see that? So much narrower lumen. So final thing about smooth muscles is that they come in two different tastes: the unitary smooth muscles and the multi-unit smooth muscles. In the unitary smooth muscles, okay, or sometimes they called single unit, in these muscles, all cells act together, okay? Cells are connected by gap junctions, and these muscles, the unitary type, is found in all hollow organs except the heart. And you can see here in the illustration in the bottom that within the single unit smooth muscle, cells are very close to each other, and these arrows show them communicating via gap junctions. In multi-unit smooth muscle, for example, in the ciliary muscle of the eye, there may or may not be gap junctions, usually less. Muscle fibers are independent. They contract only in response to the nervous stimuli, so they're much more coordinated, okay? And they do have motor units, just like skeletal muscle. Now, if you think about where it is found, iris of the eye precisely regulates the diameter of your pupil. Ciliary muscle of the eye precisely regulates the shape of the lens and therefore the eye accommodation. So those are highly coordinated activities, unlike the peristalsis in the intestine. So this concludes our conversation about muscle physiology, and we're going to jump to muscle anatomy, which will go much faster. So, few highlights about muscle actions. That's going to be quick. Muscles pull, and muscles often operate in groups. So, main groups. For every movement, there is a primary mover or agonist. There is an antagonist that produces the opposite move. For instance, if agonist produces flexion, antagonist produces extension. Synergists are usually smaller muscles that help the prime mover. The specific type of the synergist, called fixator, immobilizes the origin. Now, these are the rules for the movements. So if the muscle crosses the front of the joint, it will result in flexion. Its action. For instance, your pectoral muscles flex your shoulder. Crossing on the back produces extension. Latissimus dorsi, extend your shoulders. If the joint is crossed on the lateral side, it's going to result in abduction. For instance, your deltoid muscle crosses your shoulder joint on the lateral side and abducts an arm, while teres major crosses the shoulder joint on the medial side, which results in adduction. And that rule is pretty much applied to every joint, well, that can be flexed or extended or abducted or adducted. There are joints that cannot do that, but we're not focusing on that part. Muscle naming. Usually the name gives away something about a muscle, either a location or a function or both, maybe size. So one of the best, shape, deltoid, size, say maximus or minimus, direction of fibers. Rectus means straight, transversus means the transverse plane, oblique, diagonal. Number of origins can be mentioned, so biceps or triceps, two or three. Location and action, so for instance flexor or extensor. And in the names sometimes there are several criteria that can be used. So for instance, hear me out. This muscle is extensor, so it extends. Carpi, so it extends, it's attached, it's inserted into carpals, which means it extends your wrist. Radialis, this is origin, and it runs along the radius bone. And longus means that it is a longer muscle. There is also brevis, which is a shorter one. So different fascicle arrangements. My goal is not to focus a lot on this, but rather give you an idea that we can judge the force of the muscle, the strength of the muscle, based on the arrangement of the fibers. So usually circular and not particularly strong, okay? Convergent are usually pretty strong muscles, okay? Because a bunch of fibers all converge on the single insertion point. Parallel usually weak, okay? Such as sartorius. Fusiform, spindle-shaped, but it's usually single origin, single insertion, but a bunch of fibers. So these muscles, I will put them in the medium strength category. And then there are pennate, which can be bipennate or multipennate muscles. They have most fibers, and they usually are the strongest. They may not produce a really long move, but they generate a pretty enormous strength, and we're going to highlight some of those muscles. So when muscles act on your bones, they always act through a system of levers. So as you know, levers can work differently. There are 3 different categories, okay? But basically, you can work with the mechanical advantage, or you can work with the mechanical disadvantage. What's the difference? If you are looking for the powerful contraction, generating a lot of effort, you will have to, the trade-off will be slow movement or short movement. When you use, I'm blanking on the word. What this guy is using? What is that? A jack, yes, fine. He's using jack, right? So this gentleman doesn't have to use an enormous effort to lift the car. The point is, the distance in the power lever, the distance between the load and the fulcrum of a lever, the basis point, the foundation point, is much smaller than the distance between the effort and the fulcrum as well. In the speed lever, the distance between the load and the fulcrum are similar or even very short. The ideal example of a speed lever isn't even a shovel. It's a baseball bat. The baseball player, the hitter, holds the bat at its thin end, right? But when they swing it, they have to use an enormous amount of force. But the speed at which the thick end moves and hits the ball, because of that mechanical disadvantage, the fulcrum and the effort are very close to each other, but the load is way far. Load is the ball. That allows to give that ball an enormous speed. Am I making sense? So classes are categorized by the relative positions of the load, the fulcrum, and the effort. So what I'm going to do actually, I'm going to move between these two and exemplify the actions of those, the examples of those different lever systems in the human body. First class lever, teeter-totter. Okay, fulcrum is in the center. Example, scissors. Okay? Here's the demonstration of the speed lever versus power lever using scissors. Imagine that you are cutting paper, right? Often the scissor handles are pretty short because you don't have to develop a lot of effort. Does that make sense? Yep. Now imagine you need to cut a twig on the tree. You know, with those cutters? Yeah. What about the size of the handles versus the size of the blades? The blades are very, very short, and the handles are enormous, because only this allows you to generate enough power to get through a twig. Okay? Second class lever, load is between the fulcrum and the effort, like in a wheelbarrow. And in the third class lever, the effort is between the load and the fulcrum, such as in the tweezers, yes. So our muscles, for instance, sternocleidomastoid muscle, okay, you can see that the fulcrum, which is mastoid process, is located between the load and the effort. Okay, the load is, it's not sternocleidomastoid, this is scalene. The load is the weight of your head, okay? The fulcrum is your first cervical vertebrae, the atlas, and the effort are scalene muscles, okay? Wheelbarrow, second type, your gastrocnemius muscles. The load is your entire body and is between the fulcrum, which is your toes, and the effort that is produced by gastrocnemius muscles. And finally, the third type of a lever, where the effort is between the load and the fulcrum, is a biceps. And speaking of a biceps, so this is the fulcrum, this is the effort, this is the load. Is that a speed lever or is it a power lever? What do you think? How do you know? It's a power, no, it's a speed lever, because what you need to, let me show you. You need to look at the distance between the effort and the fulcrum, which is very short, and the load and the fulcrum, which is very long. That's the speed lever. The power lever will be here, where distance between the load and the fulcrum is shorter than the distance between the effort and the fulcrum. Okay? Does that make sense?